big cup, and hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Gilmore Way Podcast. This week, we've got our first character study. We're going to be diving deep into the character arcs and psyches of Emily and Richard Gilmore. Lorelai and Rory may have been largely estranged from the grandparents for most of Rory's life, so we're seeing them at a time when efforts are being made to reestablish some kind of normal relationship between them. And season 1 is a time of major emotional reckonings for pretty much everyone involved, but especially Emily and Richard, and that's why we wanted to talk about them first.
Just a quick reminder before we get started that this is a spoilers all podcast. So if you don't want to know about the fates of these characters all the way until the end of the revival, you might want to duck out now. And if you could take a moment to hit the like and the subscribe button before we get into it, that would be a huge help to us.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's get started. So why don't we start off with, what are some of your favorite or best Emily and Richard moments?
Okay. I think collectively my favorite moment from the both of them within the show, but this is something that I think Richard really spearheaded, was when he has Strobe and Francine over for dinner, and Christopher's there, and they're talking about Christopher and trying to still just get his life together, but things quickly devolve and just turn very sour. And Richard steps up to the plate in such an amazing, father figure moment and defends Lorelai and just says, "My daughter has been successful. She is the owner of this inn. She runs it. How dare you come into my house and criticize her and her success in that way?" And then Strobe continues and says, she always held Christopher back. She ruined his life. She was the reason why he never got to Princeton. And you just see how angry he gets, and he defends her, and eventually it leads to him just saying, "Get out of my house." And Strobe's like, "Well, I'm leaving." And he's like, "You're not leaving. I'm kicking you out." And for all of the problems that Emily and Richard have always had with Lorelai and the contentious nature of that relationship, that always just sits with me so beautifully that Richard is defending his daughter in that way and that he's sticking up for her. And Emily does it too throughout the course of the series. But that stands out to me as just a really, you stepped up for your daughter moment. And that is one of my favorite.
Yeah, that's a double-edged sword one for me. So skipping ahead a little, I'm going to give you one of my worst moments, which I guess would be the aftermath of that, where he's talking to Lorelai in his study, and he's like, "Why do you think I did it, Lorelai? He was, insulting my family in my house, and I couldn't stand for it. Do you think I was happy that you got pregnant at 16 and ran away? And do you think I love the boy who got you pregnant? I was just, defending the Gilmore name, essentially." And so it shows that he was more concerned with defending the family honor than defending Lorelai specifically. And so it sort of taints that moment for me a little bit, but Strobe still had it coming. Mm-hmm. So I still do really enjoy that entire scene and how it really displays the dynamics between the Gilmores themselves and between the Gilmores and the Haydens. So I can get on board with that. One of my favorites is when in season 1, episode 18, when Richard comes in at dinner and says, "My mother's coming next week," basically. And then Emily flips out and goes to the basement to all the stuff in storage and has this whole rant about Trix's gift-giving proclivities. And it's like, I have to unpack these things. I have to get out everything she's ever given us. 35 years worth of fish lamps and dog statues, lion tables, and stupid naked angel butts. Whoa, stupid naked angel butts? What, did David Mamet just stop by?
Maybe.
And then, she just goes on this whole tirade, and she's like, she doesn't give you a present, she gives you a present, and then she tells you where to put it and how to use it and what it costs, for insurance purposes, of course. And God forbid you should have a different opinion, or you don't think it works in the space, or you just get tired of waking up every morning with those horrifying animals staring at you. And then Lorelai looks at the dogs and she's like, she's just upset.
Yeah.
That whole sequence is just hilarious, just perfectly acted. And, just again, with the dynamics, with Trix and, the fact that Emily is so unaware that this is the same dynamic she has with Lorelai. She just has no concept and is not putting these puzzle pieces together that this is exactly how she treats her own daughter. And then, of course, later with the coat rack, when she calls Lorelai at the end, she's like, "I need the coat rack. The fish flies at night." So just that whole concept of exactly how demanding Trix is and how it gets under Emily's skin just always makes for perfect comedy.
Yeah, we'll talk about Trix a little bit later on in this episode and how she factors into Emily and how she treats Lorelai because of how Trix treats her. But keeping it lively to start us out, we've talked about favorite moments. What about some of your favorite quotes from either Richard or Emily?
Oh, Lord. I have so many good quotes. Like, one of my favorites for Richard is when he's golfing with Luke in season 5, and he asks Luke about his hobbies, and Luke says he's big on reading, and he's trying to come up with a name of a book, and Luke's like, Dick guy, science fiction guy, Dick something Dick. And then Richard says, well, I'll bring up Dick on the internet, see what comes up.
Yeah, you do that, Richard. See what happens.
What about you? Any others? I've got more, but let's go back and forth and ping pong this.
Okay. I mean, obviously, we all, at this point, Emily is one of my favorite characters. So a lot of my favorites are going to come from her because I think that anytime she is speaking, it's just gold. And you'll understand why this is also one of my favorites. Well, I'm not going to be the one that sits at home alone in the dark like an Italian widow.
Yes. I mean, you being Italian and all, I can see that being, particularly funny to you.
Yeah, yeah. It was a very mafia movie nostalgic too, with just thinking back to a wife who's just like, yeah, my husband's probably up doing some shady stuff, but
yeah, suddenly have an urge to watch The Godfather. Not sure what that's about.
I don't know. Great movie though.
I only just saw it in December, so I'm catching up on. I know I'm catching up on all the Gilmore culture, so we're getting there.
Yeah.
Next
up for you. Go ahead.
In Driving Miss Gilmore, when Lorelai's like, "Mom, I'm really busy," and she's like, "Well, I'm sorry, Lorelai. Next time I have some sort of illness, you can put me on an iceberg and float me out to sea."
Don't ever do that. But I get it.
So good.
Yeah. Again, just stemming from me being an Italian, spaghetti and meatballs is just too much excitement.
Yes.
Which I don't even need Emily to tell me that. It is.
Yeah. I get excited about spaghetti. Not so much the meatballs because I'm a vegetarian, but, same vibes.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there are going to be some people watching this too who, and this is more of an inside joke, will know about midnight lasagna. And there was sheer excitement for that as well. So carbs and sauce and just meat going together, it can bring some really good vibes.
Yeah, I missed the midnight lasagna, but I would have missed it anyway because, once again, vegetarianism, don't really love beef. So,
yeah,
what can I say? Never really liked the stuff. It's not a testament to your cooking or anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's just actually a very good cook.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so this one's less a quote than a rant, but I have to. I just have to because it is one of Emily's best moments. Now, let's talk about your money. You were a 2-bit gold digger, fresh off the bus from Hicksville when you met Mitchum at whatever bar you happened to stumble into. And what made Mitchum decide to choose you to marry amongst the pack of women he was betting at the time, I'll never know. But hats off to you for bagging him. He's still a playboy, Well, of course you know. That would explain why your weight goes up and down 30 pounds every other month. But that's your cross to bear. But these are ugly realities. No one needs to talk about them. Those kids are staying together for as long as they like. You won't stop them. Now enjoy the event. Praise be, Queen Emily.
All hail Emily. Kelly Bishop, just nailing those like lines home. But yeah, I actually was watching that. I was rewatching that episode 2 nights ago. Every time no one will wreck you like Emily Gilmore. I actually I want to meet Kelly Bishop in person and just be like, please just tear me down.
Yes, just destroy me. Her and Mrs. Kim. I need a breaking down from both of them.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of got a little bit of one thanks to this podcast partner of mine for getting me a cameo from Emily Kuroda.
Yeah, I'll have her verbally abuse you more in the future. Don't worry.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
Yeah. Again, next up for me, I'm going to keep going back to Emily because she's my favorite and she's got some real zingers. So how can I not? When Richard says, only prostitutes have 2 glasses of wine at lunch. And she's like, well, then buy me a boa and drive me out to Reno because I am open for business.
Iconic. Best. Oh, I want that on a wine glass.
Noted.
Yeah, I know they're on Etsy, but the last I checked, they were really expensive. So I did not indulge myself at the time, but maybe in the future I will.
Yeah.
I've got at least one more Emily and one more Richard. Okay, so my last Emily one will be bullshit.
That's it.
When they moved to Netflix and they could finally swear. She's the only one who swears in the revival, at least full on. There's a moment where Lorelai goes, "What the fuck?" and they stop her. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so the only full swear word comes out of Emily's mouth when she keeps saying artifice and bullshit and bullshit and bullshit to the DAR ladies. Mm-hmm. And it's just one of those moments that it's just a highlight of the entire revival because, again, they had it coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't have it pulled up to read, nor would I, because it's long and maybe not fully like appropriate, but Emily's monologue / short paragraph in the revival when she's working at the Natural History Museum and she's just talking to all of the children about whaling and everything that entails, but she gets really graphic with it in front of small children. Yeah. Again, I don't have it in front of me to read, but that would also be one of my favorites.
Just buckets and buckets of blood.
Yeah.
Yes. Once again, iconic. Like, mm-hmm. Who knew that Emily knew so much about whaling? Just great. Okay. And then my last one that I really want to touch on is a Richard quote from the series finale. It takes a remarkable person to inspire all of this. Just the way that he acknowledges Lorelai's success and her community in Stars Hollow when he sees them like really coming together for Rory's graduation is just such a beautiful moment.
Yeah. Ooh, right at the heartstrings with that. Yeah. Well, I'm going to move us on to a bit of a heavier topic now within the context of this conversation. We've had our fun with favorite moments, favorite quotes, but now it's time to get into it a little bit more. We mentioned this phrase in one of the episodes that we just recently did, but I want to bring it back because I think it is so prevalent and central to the conversation piece surrounding Emily and Richard, and that is helicopter grandparenting. And I feel like there is so much to say about it that we're about to get into right now. But I will start off with just they embody it. We'll get into the definition of it, some of the characteristics behind it, what helicopter grandparenting entails, which is not too different from, normal parental helicoptering. But everything that I've read on it just shouted Emily and Richard to me. So I want to start talking about that, how it relates to what Trix did in terms of her treatment with Emily and the residual effects of that with how Emily then treated Lorelai, with how Lorelai treated Rory. But most centrally to that was just then how Emily and Richard conducted themselves and how they treated Rory throughout this entire show. So I want to lead us there. But any initial thoughts just off of how helicopter parenting and or grandparenting can be good in any way, if it can be, or just what strikes you as how it's so detrimental?
It's harder to see situations where it's good, but one that comes to mind is if it's very obvious that the parents are neglectful or abusive of the child. Like, it might be more justified for them to insert themselves and sort of cross boundaries when it's clear that the parents, so like the children of the grandparents, are not really doing their job. And so that doesn't really feel like the case with Lorelai, and so it seems so much more egregious when Emily and Richard do it, because up until they get involved in their lives, Rory seems to be relatively well-adjusted. She's, a little shy and quiet and, maybe not the most social person, but she and Lorelai are doing pretty well in life. And when they get their sticky little paws into the situation, that's kind of when Rory starts going downhill a little bit. And so I think by trying to, insert themselves in that dyad of like mother-daughter relationship, it just really impacts Rory in a negative way, because their ideals and expectations and pressures are different than those that Lorelai had been imparting on her all these years. And so it starts to sort of, almost divide Rory's loyalties. And so it can get really sticky when someone else tries to come in and tell you how to raise your kids or tell your kids how they should be.
Mm-hmm. So going off of that initially, it seems like you would conclude that you feel like Lorelai had done a good job with raising Rory. And so that from the get-go, Richard and Emily were seemingly overstepping from the start. Yes or no?
I think so. I think they're trying to make that clear to us in Lorelai's first day at Chilton, when Emily keeps calling Lorelai and saying, I bought her the Chilton socks and I want to get her the Chilton coat. What size is she? And I'm buying her a parking space even though she doesn't have a car. And then setting up the DSL line without their approval. She's just trying to do things. And even though they come from a well-meaning place, it's clear that like from the get-go, the minute they're back involved in their lives, especially because there's a financial entanglement, it's clear that they want some level of involvement and control. And it continues from there and escalates. And, we see it in Rory's dance. It's a great example when Dean is honking and Emily won't let Rory go out to him because it's not the proper way to do it. And so, she starts trying to teach Rory these, manners and customs that, Lorelai doesn't give a crap about, and rightly so. It's kind of silly that means anything. So yeah, it's fairly obvious that they are actively inserting themselves quite a bit in Rory's life, and it escalates over time. Especially, I was thinking about this quite a bit, and like it happens a lot in season 3, and then of course again in season 6. It's like in season 3 when Richard starts inserting himself in the decision about where Rory goes to school, going so far as to manipulate her into taking an interview at Yale. And then, of course, Rory going to them to pay for Yale and all those things, so that they become even more involved in the life again. So, yeah. And obviously, season 6, just the whole thing.
Yeah. I do want us to get, I'm not going to have this be an episode where we completely bash Richard and Emily, because they do have redeeming moments. And I want us to talk about those too. But I just really want us to get going and illustrate the moments here where the behavior is problematic, so that when we do get around to those good things, that it's a little more transparent as to why they're good. One of the things that really stuck out to me when I was reading about this whole concept of helicopter grandparenting, but I think this is also something that we see just within parents who do this as well, just this really warped mindset of thinking that everything that I am doing is to serve and help my child, when really all you're doing is floundering their independence and really inhibiting their emotional well-being? Is there anything or instances amongst all 7 seasons where you could pinpoint, like, yeah, that's really happening here and it's not good? And do you think that Lorelai and Rory ever recognize it, or are they just completely railroaded and unable to see how they're being diminished?
I'm going to start with the second part of your question. Lorelai is far more attuned to it than Rory is, because she has a lot more experience in dealing with their particular methods of manipulation. She's done a lot of reflection, is clear over the years, about the methods of control that they try to use with her. And so, you can see it frequently. She warns Rory, going back to the example of when they visit Yale for the first time, and Rory tells her initially, and then she says, my father's trying to manipulate you. And then Rory kind of pushes back and be like, I know he's manipulating me and he's trying to control my life and make me just like him and make me wear pearls. Did I miss anything? And um, it's clear that Lorelai sees that coming. She's rarely railroaded by them, probably except with the exception of the end of season 5, when she goes to them for help and they go behind her back and let Rory move in and drop out of Yale. And so that leads me to the first part of your question, which is like the instances of seeing it happening where they think they're doing the right thing and that, they just know what's best, is them, going against their word with the discussion they had with Lorelai and doing what they thought was right with Rory, which was clearly wrong. And Richard even acknowledges that. He goes to Lorelai with his tail between his legs. He doesn't think of it that way, but I do. And says, this isn't right. I should never have gone against you. So, yeah, that's when they really missed the mark and showed that they misunderstood Rory and Lorelai and the wisdom of her parenting choices of letting Rory make decisions for herself. And so they came in and they tried to do the same thing all over again that they did to Lorelai. And once again, it backfired because it wasn't Lorelai that was the problem. It was them.
Yeah, I agree. I'll follow it up with this, and we're talking about this, and a lot of like parenting perspectives are going to come into this. So there's a lot of overlap there, but we're going to try and, keep this solely focused on how Richard and Emily parent, how Lorelai parents. Do you think that, and we can even go back as far as to say, like with Richard and Trix, do you think in terms of parenting, do children ever owe their parents anything at all? Whether it's gratitude, whether it's reciprocation for money that's been loaned, whether it's housing that's been provided, anything at all. Is there anything that a child should ever feel like they owe their parents, or that they need to be responsible for, or thankful for, or grateful for? Or should parenting, as we know of it, but as we see with Emily and Richard and how they treat Lorelai and how then Lorelai interacts with Rory, should it just be more of, no, I'm doing this because you're my child and that's my responsibility to you? And how do you think that plays out in the show with Lorelai feeling like she constantly owes her parents for so much?
Okay, there's a difference too between feeling like you owe your parents something and being manipulated by them where their help is conditional. So I think that's the position that Lorelai is in. And, there's a far more complex type of relationship with a lot of people who maybe aren't in the same position as Lorelai is with her parents. But the thing about being a parent is that when you sign up to do it, you kind of know what you're getting into. Once you decide to bring a child into this world, it is your responsibility to feed them, clothe them, keep a roof over their head. And that is just the bare minimum of what you should be doing. emotional involvement is even more important, but not every parent can get there because of their own upbringings, which is really unfortunate. And it's hard to recognize that when you're having your own kids. And that's how these cycles tend to perpetuate, is that people don't recognize the abuses or the dysfunction of their own childhood, or maybe they don't even remember it and they just have these sort of emotional reactions that they don't quite understand, and then they pass that on to the next generation. So in general, we don't owe our parents for giving us the bare minimum. However, I think, once we become adults, and they're no longer really quote unquote responsible for us, once we're no longer minors and we have a lot more agency and we have, legal rights, we can vote and we can work and we can take out credit and all of those things. Once we're adults and living in the world, they don't necessarily owe us stuff like that, or additional help. Most parents will offer it freely. Even Richard and Emily seem to be very generous with their help, but they are so manipulative that, there are strings, Pinocchio.
Well,
So
that's the thing. Like, they are generous, but their generosity is stemming from manipulation because they know that they can hold that, like, they'll have that financial claw and that hold over Lorelai and by association Rory, so that they can then use that for their own manipulation and for their own purposes and whatever they decide. And we even see that at the end of the show where Emily is wanting to finance a tennis court at the new space that Lorelai and Suki are now running, because she still wants to have that hold, and she thinks like, well, if I finance this and I have this financial involvement, it will still mandate that Lorelai feels responsible for coming to dinner and being a part of my life. And that's so wrong. And it's followed up immediately by Lorelai saying like, listen, you don't need to do that because we've repaired our relationship enough over all of these years where I'm going to still come to Friday night dinner and be a part of your life now without you needing to throw money at me. But it still is so surprising to me that even after all of these years, Emily is still feeling like she needs to default to that. And I also, like, I can't fully blame, I mean, I think that's wrong of Emily to do, but I have to give Lorelai some, I don't know, maybe like a, you know, just like, very, what's the word? Just not shame, but like, I don't know, a slap on the wrist of, after all this time, your mother still feels like that's the only way that she's going to have you in her life. So maybe you as a daughter, not that you owe her again anything beyond those original base points that you illustrated, but if Emily is still feeling like that's what it's going to take to keep you there, I don't think then maybe Lorelai has done what she should have as a daughter to make her mother understand that at the end of the day, it's not always going to boil down to that anymore.
yeah, it's an interesting one because you can tell that Emily does it out of habit almost. Like, gift giving is clearly her love language. She uses money as a way to express love, and but she often does it in a way that requires that kind of manipulation, and it is one of those conditional circumstances. But I also think that she's just sort of still got this deep fear that Lorelai won't be around anymore if she doesn't have a reason to interact with them, like if there isn't some sort of tie. It's one of those things where I think she would give her the money, just carte blanche, but she wants to use it as an excuse to maintain that relationship, and it's not the healthiest way to do it. And it's clear in the revival, as they're going to therapy, that there's still more repair that relationship needs before they really start to trust each other. So, at the end of the series, we're in a better place with their relationship, but it's still not fixed. But at least Lorelai is, breaking down some of her walls when it comes to her parents, and is starting to try to build a relationship with them on terms that don't involve financial enmeshment, because that's where things always get messy for them. And I think she realizes that maybe if she just sort of like extends the olive branch, maybe it won't be so transactional all the time. So there's that. But yeah, exactly. Like, you don't get a medal just for providing the basics.
Mm-hmm.
And like, your kids don't owe you interaction or respect or gratitude unless those things are reciprocal and healthy. And yeah, like the whole "I put a roof over your head" argument is extremely manipulative. And they use this with Rory too. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we furnished your $40,000 sex house and look at how you treat us. Like, no. There's more to it than that, and you shouldn't have done that in the first place. But like, people will tell you that you should be grateful for everything your parents have done for you. And setting boundaries with someone doesn't mean that you're not appreciative of what they've done for you, but it just means that, you know, they'll get what they give emotionally, not just materially. If that makes sense.
It does. And I agree with all of that. And Emily and Richard realize, especially with, not listening to Lorelai as she was illustrating why, like, how and like just how Mitchum broke Rory down, and how that was probably factoring into why she's not finishing school and going back to school and pursuing a career path. And they didn't like there that's just one example, but there were so many instances of them not even listening to their own daughter, and then not listening to their granddaughter too, when they had real, like, just emotional struggles that they were having to combat. But it was always just about what Emily and Richard feel is best, and not how they're factoring in what is best for Lorelai and Rory. And when you perpetuate that, and you're always just going to make it about what you feel is best for a person, but you're not factoring in their own desires, of course your relationship is going to struggle. We've talked about how Emily does this really poorly. Do you think that Richard did any better if at all, with this?
No. I think they were both totally inept at listening. And it's funny because Richard calls Emily out on it in season 2, at the debutante ball. And he's like, "I've told you what I'm going through, but somehow you just don't seem to hear it. You don't listen to me. You don't listen to anybody." And then Richard asks Lorelai, "Isn't it true? Has she ever listened to a word you've said?" And then Lorelai has this great quote where she says, "Well, people listen in different ways, right? I mean, some people listen with their ears and some people listen with not their ears. But that doesn't mean that some actual listening hasn't happened in some form." And it just goes to show how none of them know how to communicate, and how
Amen.
it just sort of goes over their head. And they, again, with the helicopter hovering, they do what they think is right without actually processing the real underlying needs of Lorelai and Rory.
Yeah, I concur. I'm going to transition us to now talking. I just want to shift it to talking about Emily and Richard's marriage. We talked a little bit about how their proposal went down, how they had a decades long, for the most part, successful marriage. They did have a period of separation, and they had fights and arguments, as all married couples will. But initial thoughts on their marriage on the whole.
This is such a tough one because in some ways it's clear that they're perfect for each other and it's clear that they love each other. But I also think that they got together at a time when expectations for relationships were very different. And we see this come up in I Am Kayak, Hear Me Roar after Richard has his heart attack and Emily is trying to keep things afloat while he's watching golf reruns. Worst way to spend your time, by the way.
2 thumbs
Awful.
down.
Yeah, hard pass. But, she is forced to reflect on just how tied she is to him and what her life will mean without him. And she talks to Lorelai about the system, she went to school, she got her degree. She very much came up in the time when women were expected to go to college just to get their MRS degree. She went from her parents' house to the sorority house to Richard's house. That was the way it was done. You went to college to meet an eligible man who had an education. And so that's what she thought she was supposed to do. And so she got married and she ran his household for him. She helped with his business contacts and clients and colleagues all these years in fulfillment of the role she thought she was supposed to have as the dutiful wife. And then Richard was the main breadwinner, and he relied on her to maintain his domestic world, right? So that was the system, and it was working for them until it wasn't. And this is something that we as a society have noticed over the past several decades, where we want more choice and freedom within our marriages to not have that system be in place because it makes you so dependent on someone else. And so, like, their marriage has its moments of extreme sweetness and beauty and love, but then there's always this undercurrent of what are they without each other? And I don't know that you can have a healthy marriage when you don't have two people who are independent and who choose to come together to live their lives side by side. I think we're starting to move away from that model and that system as a society for good reason. And it just shows how reliant they are on each other and how dangerous that can be when you're so dependent on someone else. So I have mixed feelings about it because, they are cute together and they really have their moments. But I also don't want to hold them up as like a model for an ideal marriage either.
So going off of what you just said, and perhaps you just already answered it, do you think that their marriage hit a level of dangerous and or noteworthy codependency?
I think it had its moments of codependency. I don't know if I would call it dangerous. I think that they were just so conditioned to live like this, based on, the world that they came out of, that I don't know if anything else really would have worked for them. But you see it in the revival where suddenly Richard is gone and Emily has to figure out who she is. And so it adds this extra layer of grief and work she has to do to get over that loss, because not only has she lost her partner, but she's also lost herself by losing him. And she does pretty well with it. She goes to therapy and she reconnects with Lorelai and she allows Berta's family in. She finds some peace for herself on Nantucket. And so, things turn out okay for her. And she doesn't even, seem to care about dating much again. She has the opportunity to date Jack Smith and turns him down because, he's not Richard. And she's perfectly content just sort of doing things for herself now. But yeah, when Richard has his heart attack, you just really see her floundering and just being unsure of how to exist in the world without him, which I don't know if I would classify it as totally dangerous, but it's not really a great way to live. I think it's totally fine to have a partner and to share your lives in such a way that, you're both bringing something to the table, but you can still maintain your independence and not be 100% reliant on the other person for everything. So that's what that agreement between them sort of brought about. Was Emily was dependent on him financially, which can be dangerous in its own right. I don't think that there was a ton of financial abuse in their marriage. There was some with Lorelai and Rory in terms of using money to control them, but I didn't really see it with each other where he, threatened to take away any of her money or anything like that. So she wasn't really like in danger on that level. But when he passed and she inherited everything, like, if he managed this stuff all these years, how is she supposed to like know what to do with herself and not fall victim to scammers or, to losing large chunks of that money just by not knowing what to do with it? Like, it's kind of dangerous not to be financially literate in that way. And so that might be an area where, yeah, their marriage was a little dangerous. I feel like I'm rambling now, and I may have lost my train of thought a little bit, but there was something I was thinking about earlier. We see what Emily goes through when she's contemplating life without Richard, but we don't really see a flip where we see Richard contending with his life without Emily. The only brief window we get into that is when they're separated, but he's still living in the pool house. They're still in contact. He has his valet, and there's a lot of anger and resentment there as opposed to self-reflection. And so a lot of it is kind of played for drama and even sometimes played for comedy, but Richard never has to like contend with, what if Emily had passed first and he was suddenly left without someone to run all of his domestic affairs and to, keep up his household the way that Emily had all these years? Do you have any thoughts about, what, this is kind of getting into fan fiction territory a little bit, but like what Richard would be like without Emily? Because we know what Emily is like without Richard, but what about the other way around?
I feel like honestly there might not be too much of a difference because I feel like a lot of the tasks that he delegated to Emily were just conduct and organize my social affairs and my social engagements, make sure that my meals are prepared and ready to go 3 times a day when I want them. But those weren't even things like, I'll start with first off with like, meal preparation. Like Emily was not cooking breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They had household servants to do it. So if Emily's gone, household servants just continue to prepare meals for Richard. He may not, I think he loses the partner in the sense of like, I don't have anyone to organize my social engagements in terms of if I need to have like dinners or nights out with my clientele or with my business partners, and those sorts of functions. But that's not even something that I think he would then take on himself. He would probably be like, well, my wife's not here to do it because she's passed. I could see Richard just like hiring a secretary or a personal assistant and just continuing to delegate in that way. So I feel like the loss for him would just stem from, I lost the woman that I love. And again, that love isn't always transparent. They do have their struggles within their marriage, but I really feel like they did love each other. They had a very strong emotional connection and bond with one another that allowed their marriage to last as long as it did. So I don't feel like from a business standpoint or a social standpoint that he would be losing too much because he could just find other people to fill those roles for him. I think the biggest loss for Richard, had Emily passed first, would just be not having the love of your life, quote unquote, and your emotional support system there. But I feel like he still would have been okay and he would have moved on and found happiness and joy in the remaining time that he has in the same way that Emily does.
Yeah, I think the default assumption in our society is that men are independent and have a stronger sense of identity than women sometimes because, their identities are so tied to their careers most of the time. Whereas women are expected, or at least especially historically, we're expected to be wives and mothers and to sort of tie their identities to those labels, basically. And I was thinking about this earlier, like I said, and it hit me that Richard might be the main breadwinner, but that doesn't mean he's independent.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
And he's
it's really
definitely
hard.
not. He's definitely not.
I think it would hit him harder than he expects. Like, yes, he can delegate a lot of tasks, but I still think he'd be a little adrift without someone sort of, being the heart of his home. There's a difference between hiring a personal assistant and having your wife plan your Christmas holiday party, and I think there would maybe be some things that he's just kind of inept at that he's never had to take care of because she's always been there since the moment he graduated university. So part of me wishes I had seen that, because maybe, I don't want to say it feels tropey, but I think we explore women without men after widowhood more in media than we explore, what happens to the man after his wife passes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it might have been an interesting direction to go in, because Gilmore does tend to flip things on their head so often that, obviously the situation was like the hand was forced by Ed Herman's passing, which, was sad and traumatic for everyone. I think they handled it beautifully in the revival. I think that was the one thing that was handled perfectly from top to bottom. I have some qualms with other storylines from the revival, but that one was just pitch perfect. So yeah, I'm glad they didn't kill Emily off. I don't mean it in that regard, but
yeah,
they're just so good at sort of like taking some concepts and exploring them in opposite ways than you would imagine. And so it would have been nice to see a man contending with his identity as a single man and having the realization that his life is more than just his job in that process.
That was beautifully said. I don't have anything else to add because I think you just hit it home.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. I'll say, moving us kind of along, but going off of what we are talking about, Emily and Richard's marriage was not perfect. They were not always emotionally available to one another. Do you think that emotional unavailability translated into how they raised Lorelai, why it made her run for the hills and not rely on them as much as she should have? And second to that, do you think they course corrected well enough with Rory, or was there still a lot of projection and expectations that were just forced upon Rory that were just completely toxic and inappropriate?
No and yes. Or at least I think if I remember the wording of your question correctly, which I probably don't, but yeah, they were emotionally unavailable. And, Richard was off traveling the world for work so often. And even though Emily was her role was to be the domestic goddess, I still don't think she had a super strong hand maybe in raising Lorelai so directly. There was probably a lot of maid and nanny work that went into that. She probably had, a slew of helpers, and especially I would imagine the infant years for Lorelai. So yeah, and there's a difference, as I said, between providing things and providing emotional support. And Lorelai clearly never got that. And no, they didn't course correct with Rory at all. Again, I alluded to this earlier, but when she moved in with them, they conducted themselves seemingly as they did with Lorelai, where they put all the same expectations on her. Marry well. We love Logan. Logan, what are your intentions with Rory? How about we buy a compound on Cape Cod, our own Kennebunkport? And Emily getting her into the DAR. They just expected her to be this prim, proper lady who graduates from Yale and marries well and gets a job. And I think they had higher expectations for her maybe than they did for Lorelai, because maybe they'd made peace by this point with the way that Lorelai's life had turned out and it not being what they wanted for her. They thought she had so much potential. But the whole point with Rory was to give her everything that Lorelai never got. And again, alluded to this earlier, but they assumed the problem was Lorelai. They assumed that it was just her wild nature and her rebelliousness, or, her personality traits like that kept her from the life she should have had in their eyes. And they viewed Rory as their perfect golden child now, their second chance. And they never stopped to think that their tactics the first time around was what made Lorelai rebel in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And so Richard sees it in Welcome to the Dollhouse that their tactics aren't working with her, and she is, going in a direction that they don't like for her. And he just tries to manipulate her or bribe her or, any of these other tactics that are not healthy. And so once again, they just fall short of that self-reflective, effective parenting bar that parents need to hit, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
What about you? Do you think that they did any better with Rory?
No, there was still a lot of projection because everything that they had always wanted for Lorelai that they never got out of their daughter, they just placed all of those hopes on Rory's shoulders to be the daughter that they never got. And like Lorelai, she didn't even fail in life. She was successful, but she didn't follow a career path or made choices that were in line with what Emily and Richard wanted. So when Rory rolls around, I would hope that they would see this as an opportunity to do better, but they still just place all of that weight on her shoulders. And Rory tries to live up to what she sees as like what her grandparents want for her. And she's able to live up to some of it, but she even cracks under the pressure that is stemming from just internal pressure, but pressure that I think is also coming from Emily and Richard. And when she cracks and she folds under that pressure and she needs a year or so to just step back, hit the reset button, take time for yourself to focus on your well-being, Emily and Richard can't always recognize it. And I even think that just with them giving her the pool house was more so just not them even trying to help her. I think it was just, we have her under our control. She's here. We'll know her comings and goings. We'll know who she's associating with. We even have a moment of Logan visiting her and Richard intercepting that as they're trying to just go back to the pool house and being like, come in for a nightcap. And Logan's like, oh, okay. But they're still, I think they gave her the pool house to monitor her in the same way that they were always trying to monitor Lorelai, not because you genuinely were trying to help her get back on her feet, and maybe to an extent you were, but I don't think that was the prime motivation there. I think it was just all about control. And it just shows me that you're not doing any better with your granddaughter than you did with your daughter, because you're making those exact same mistakes all over again. And that's why Lorelai fought it. That's why Rory fights it, because you're just exerting such control over, especially with Rory, she's over the age of 18. She is a full-fledged legal, adult. You can't do that anymore. It's not proper. But Emily and Richard never recognized that.
Yeah, I think of the moment where they actually go search the pool house trying to figure out what's up with her because, she's just so opaque to them, I guess. Which is weird unto itself because she's really not. They just don't know anything about her really. Or at least not what they should know, I guess. And so they go looking through her things a little bit. And they think back to searching Lorelai's room in exactly the same way. And she's like, when I did this with Lorelai, she had this whole drawer full of Tootsie Rolls. And I'm like, what does a girl need with a drawer full of Tootsie Rolls? And then Richard suggests, well, what was under them? And she's like, oh my God, under the Tootsie Rolls. Again, just one of those moments of cluelessness. Come on. How dumb are you? Of course, Rory especially, she's nearly 21 at this point. Of course she's, what is the terminology they use? She might be thinking about getting intimate with this boy. Is it Is that the word? I can't remember, but you know, they just assume she's still such a child and that she couldn't possibly be having sex with Logan. And God, one of my favorites is that dinner where they bring in their reverend.
Yes.
It's like, you know, think very carefully about who you give your most precious gift to, because you'll have to buy the next guy a sweater.
And then I just love seeing like Alexis acting that out and just being like, so about that.
Yeah. The
ship sailed.
The ship has sailed. It's probably in Fiji by now.
But thank you for coming.
Yeah. Just amazing. But yeah, and you know, Lorelai, it may not have been so obvious how active she was in that department. But a lot of that came out of just a desire to not live the prim and proper life that her parents set out for her, and her only methods of rebellion and refusal and pushback on these ideals was, you know, stealing from their liquor cart and having sex under their nose, basically. You know, it was, she had limited options, and so that was how she presented as a wild child, basically. And obviously it led us to her having Rory in the first place, and that's how this whole thing started. So like their expectations and pressures on her that she didn't want for herself led her to pick any way she could to push against that.
Mm-hmm.
And it saddled her with a daughter who she loves deeply, but doesn't mean it was a good idea or a good time for her to have a child.
Yeah.
Something we haven't really talked about yet is like Richard and Emily as individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any? Let's start with Richard. Like, what do you think about Richard's character, you know, starting at the beginning of season 1 and how he sort of like morphs over time?
I'll start off by saying that I feel like Richard was always just a direct byproduct of Trix and that upbringing. And the apple did not fall far from the tree. In fact, I think it probably just dropped.
Very Galileo.
And just stayed right there.
He's the one who had the apple fall on him.
Newton.
Right? Oh, Newton. That's what.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think the apple even rolled or moved. I think it just plopped down from the tree and it was just like right there. I think Trix just, and it's not even just Trix. I feel like, you know, especially when you go back to the earlier part of the last century, this is just how a lot of, you know, of how the youth was being raised, where, especially since we're talking about Richard, you know, men were just brought up to, you know, be scholarly and make sure that you're educated, you know, be mindful of your physical fitness, be mindful of, you know, again, just, you know, your like just your smarts and everything, and then just prepare yourself in life to know that you're going to be the breadwinner. You know, find a woman to marry, settle down, have kids, you know, have the nice suburban household, have, you know, the family car, and just live that sort of lifestyle and really do it in a no nonsense sort of way. And that's how Richard, I think, was raised by Trix. And so it's striking to me that even first and foremost that Trix is just so dismissive and just so, like, her just disapproval of Emily is right there from the start, where she's like, this is absolutely not the woman I want for you. But going back to the original question, I don't love Richard as a person for how he starts out, but I feel like a lot of that foundation of who he is at his core is not necessarily something that we can blame him for, because I think it just stems from a really corrupt upbringing. And when you have decades of a mother raising you in that way, but we even see it when Trix returns to Connecticut and she is still just mentally effing with him and exerting that control, he just defaults to her and her wishes with everything. And he almost becomes like sort of like a puppy where he can't even think for himself. It's whatever his mother wants. So I don't love how weak of a character we see him be in those moments when he's so strong of a figure personality wise elsewhere, especially within the business world.
Mm-hmm.
So that's always something that I don't love. But we see him try and do better over the seasons. And it even starts from season 1, where he's recognizing that Rory is going to have goals and aspirations that maybe don't fall in line with what he and Emily want, but he's going to be supportive of them. I think the biggest way in which he does better is recognizing not even so much with Rory, but I think he and Emily have the most progressive arc with recognizing that Lorelai has led a successful life and that their daughter may have not gone down the path that she wanted them to, that they wanted her to, but that she's content in her life. So I love seeing that arc over time, starting from season 1 until season 7, from Richard and Emily, but we're just talking about Richard right now, with him realizing my daughter's a successful business person. She runs her own inn. She has social and really excellent management skills. And then it's something that you said before, where at the end of season 7, there's that great line where he says, like, it takes a remarkable person to inspire all of this. And he's alluding to the communal love that is being shown, but that communal love wouldn't be there if Rory didn't have excellent character and social skills, and she wasn't just a great human being. And I love that he's able to recognize that his daughter is a wonderful and wondrous person in her own right, even if she never lived up to what he had in mind for her.
Mm-hmm. I agree with all that. And I'm going to add a little. I have always kind of thought that, like, he does more development in Kill Me Now than in the rest of the series. Like, he sort of turns from that cold, aloof, conservative guy into like you start to see him reveal his warm and loving nature after that. Whereas at first, like, he's got this wall up when it comes to his daughter and granddaughter because of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so after he starts to become really fond of Rory, you see that facade drop a little bit. You see it slip away, and you see him be very, loving and affectionate toward his mother as well. So, like, those are two people that he's very affectionate with. The third, obviously, being Emily. He's not as warm and fuzzy most of the time with Lorelai. So when it does happen, it's quite nice to see.
Mm-hmm.
But, he sort of has this very abrupt switch in the 3rd episode of the 1st season. And after that, I feel like he stays pretty steady and sort of plateaus a little bit in his development until about season 7, when his heart attack causes him to sort of like open up and be even more vulnerable. He has moments where he has to adapt to stuff, like when he retires and has to learn how to exist without going to work every day. And he and Emily have to negotiate how their lifestyle looks now, because, there's the Richard and Stars Hollow episode where Emily can't stand having him around all the time because, they got married, went on their honeymoon, came home, and he just went to work. And so she's not used to having him around all the time. And he has to figure out what to do with his time and who he is now that he's no longer, the vice president of the Gurman Driscoll Insurance Corporation. And so I still don't think that's necessarily character development. It's something that he has to go through and adjust to, but it doesn't feel like a true realization for him necessarily. And then he has a little bit of change in season 4 when he goes into business with Jason, and Jason starts to modernize some of his ideas about how business is done. But other than that, I feel like his character stays pretty consistent in terms of how he behaves and interacts with our main characters. And so he's very stable. But I think part of that stability is also passivity. And so it
Mhm.
seems like he bends to things around him, including Trix and Emily. And especially in his personal life, like his professional life is his outlet away from everyone, right? But, and he gets to be the big man and make the big calls in those domains. But other people have such an impact on him in his domestic life, and him growing up in an environment with someone like Trix is probably exactly why he ended up with a wife like Emily, who would like
Mhm.
similarly dominate and care for him in that kind of respect. And it made him a bit of an enabler to be that passive and to just like watch Trix abuse Emily and to watch Emily abuse Lorelai, because that was just how things were and how things were done. So yeah, he doesn't have as much growth as some of the other characters, and Emily outpaces him on that front. So that's kind of why I figured we should start with him, because he's not like the less interesting of the two, I guess.
Mhm.
But let's move on to Emily, because we're kind of, running quite long on this already. Let's chat
Yeah,
about
we knew we
Emily.
were. We knew
Yeah,
we were going
we knew this
to.
was gonna happen.
Yeah, we've already talked a lot about Emily, so I don't want to get too repetitive or carry us on too much longer because again, we're already, you know, just we've had so much to say about them and we'll have so much more to say. Um, I think she does, and she does better with her acceptance of Lorelai and Rory's life than Richard does. I don't know if that I mean, I think there's an argument that can be made that just it stems from her, identifying and, the effeminate nature and her just being a female, where maybe she's able to just have more emotional resonance and connectivity and introspection than Richard might be able to. Um, but I think she does better with it. And I think that for as cold as she may come across a lot of the time, I feel like it's just a front, and it's a front that she's putting on because she feels like that is almost what is expected of her as being a domestic wife and a partner to Richard, where she can't let the truthful nature of what's really in her heart and what she's feeling unfold because it's not what's expected of her as a wife. And when you have that disconnect where you can't be emotionally sensitive, vulnerable, or just even open in the way that you want to because it's seen as not societally appropriate. That's really sad.
Yeah.
Um, but I think at the core, like, this is a woman who she really does love her daughter, and she really does love her granddaughter, and Richard does too. But again, we're just talking about Emily now. But she really loves the both of them. And her love language might be weird sometimes. It might not be what we deem appropriate or what we think it should be, but it comes out. I mean, I even think of like, when she kicks Christopher out because he's upsetting Lorelai, and when she's trying to explain, like, you being right here right now hurts me. Do you not understand how much this is affecting me? And she's right there to say, like, leave. You need to go now. Like, perhaps that's even noteworthy because Richard wasn't there. So maybe that's a reason why she felt that she could do that because he was removed. But case in point, like, it's not always transparent and she holds back a lot, but Emily loves her daughter and her granddaughter. And I think her arc over time just shows us that she's not always able to express that love in the way that she can or that she wants to. And I think she even holds herself back a bit too much with that. But when she allows herself to put that out there and vocalize it, it's a really beautiful thing to see. And I love those moments that we get. So I feel like she really has one of I think probably like my favorite arc throughout all 7 seasons, and especially with what we get from the revival, seeing her happiness and her joy with letting Berta's family in, finding a career path and something to do in retirement and in the aftermath of her husband passing that still just lends her so much joy and fulfillment. Emily gets there, and I don't have any qualms with how we leave off with her in the revival. I can't say that about everybody. But I will say I am fully content with what we get and how we say goodbye to Emily in the revival.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Emily's an interesting one. Even Kelly Bishop recognizes, that she's a difficult woman, and that's why she liked to play her so much, because it's just more interesting than playing a nice woman, apparently, in her books. And she's fun to watch, but she's not someone who would be fun to know in real life. It is heartwarming at times to see her come out of her shell and show some vulnerability and some true emotional connection with Lorelai and with Rory. And you're right, it is clear that she does love them. But we kind of touched on this, I think, in the generational trauma episode. Go back and check that one out if you want, like, even more on Emily. But she probably had a really troubling upbringing, and herself had emotionally unavailable or immature parents. And so she doesn't know the proper ways to express emotion and love. And that has a really negative impact on everyone around her. And it's kind of unfortunate that she feels, like you said, it is kind of a mask, a facade that she has to keep up all the time. And when you see it slip and she gets very emotional, that narcissism comes out, where she, when her emotions are being attacked, she has, like, outbursts as a way to control everyone else, even if they have to be feigned. But when other people show their emotions, she shuts down and she's like, now is not the time to be having this discussion. This discussion, I'm not going to have this talk with you right now. And she removes herself. So, we can appreciate her growth and still also recognize the abuse and the narcissism and the impacts those had on our characters, and still at the same time be empathetic to her, because at her core, you can tell she loves them and that she's just trying to prove that she's a capable wife and mother, and that she's living up to society's standards for a woman, which doesn't allow her to recognize when she fails.
Yeah.
And again, that's where that narcissism comes out, and she's just unable to self-reflect. So she's this really interesting, multi-layered character, where some moments you're like, I can't believe you just did that or said that. And others where you're like, yeah, go Emily. Like, I love you.
Yeah.
You go, girl, kind of moments. And she's just a character full of contradictions, and, just so much irony there. Something that comes to mind is how ironic it is that she's constantly criticizing Lorelai's parenting, but then praising Rory all the time. She's just scapegoating people, and she's doing things. Oh, another one that I picked out earlier was in season 4, she finds the carbon copy of the letter that Trix wrote to Emily, trying to convince him to leave her at the altar. And then the next season, she goes to Chris and tells him to go to Lorelai and try to make things work, because, she can tell that Lorelai is still in love with Chris and Luke is unsuitable for her, So what Trix tried to do to Richard, she's now trying to do to Lorelai, and she doesn't even recognize that. And she's just awful to Luke in the aftermath of the breakup and the reconciliation and all that. And so she's just so awful to watch at some points, when she's condescending and mean-spirited and controlling. But then she has those moments where she finally has a breakthrough, and then we love her again. So it's just, she's such an interesting character. I don't want to know her, and I don't want her to be my grandmother, but I agree with you that like she has the most satisfying arc of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. And I think, again, that's why. Because she's not a perfect person. And that's what makes her fun and fun and enjoyable to watch, because you know that she's not perfect. So when we get moments of like just, oh my gosh, like you actually are acting like a human being and being kind, and that's resonating because it's such a dichotomy from everything else that we normally get from this character. That I think is what makes, like you said, and like we both agree upon, her have one of the most amazing and successful and perfect arcs of this entire show, because we get both sides from her. She's not one note, she's not two note. This woman just runs the gamut of the orchestral scale with like just being all over the place with how she conducts herself in her life, and you never know what you're going to get.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what makes this character so much fun to always watch. And I bow down to you, Kelly Bishop. Just
Our queen.
Job well done.
Queen Kelly. We stan Kelly Bishop. But I have like one final thought to wrap up, and then I'll let you throw in your last thoughts as well. And then we should really get out of here because we've been going for a long time. There's just something I sort of picked up, and I'm sure other people have also noticed this, but Lorelai is sort of half and half of her parents. You know, she clearly took instruction from her mother's handling of the domestic realm in terms of how to manage a staff and how to, you know, deal with event planning and hospitality and all those kinds of things. And she spins that into her career. And she also takes, you know, Richard's business acumen and entrepreneurial spirit and, you know, drive, ambition. So she, you know, merges sort of like her parents' two personalities a little bit. And, you know, I'm sure her mother would have preferred her to live a life more like hers, you know, where she married appropriately and had a proper nickname like Bunny. But, you know, yeah, but it's clear that, you know, she took some inspiration from watching her mother all those years and combined that with being sort of envious of her father and his business success and his jet-setting lifestyle, and sort of tried to carve that for herself in her own way. So, yeah, it's just, she's so different from them in some ways, but you can really see both of them come through in how she chooses to spend her time.
Yeah, I agree. But I'll close with this final thought too. It just, what you said makes me think of how, for as much as it's transparent that like, yeah, Lorelai is really your daughter, you're still not proud of her all the time in the way that you should be. And they're even not always proud of Rory in the way that they should be. And it makes me think what is seemingly one of the biggest moments where especially Emily is the most proud of Rory is when she's doing DAR work and conducting and planning social parties and affairs and events. And I think it's just stemming from, oh my gosh, like my granddaughter's being everything that I wanted my daughter to potentially be that I didn't get. And now my granddaughter's doing it. And this is the mold that I would have wanted for her. And she's filling it. So now I can be proud and now I can praise her accomplishments. And it's like, you could have always done that. It didn't just have to be stemming from DAR work or, you know, fulfilling that sort of societal role that you were so ingrained to have be expected of you as a woman. Be proud of your daughter and be proud of your granddaughter all the time, no matter the career path they take, no matter the choices that they make, as long as they are happy and content and they're not harming anybody else, give them that support and that happiness. And don't just have it stem from a mold that you want, be just that parent and that grandparent and that support system all the time.
And that's just good general parenting advice for anyone, you know? I actually found this really great quote by Adam Grant. Let me pull it up. I've got it fairly accessible, so let me see if I can find it. Adam Grant is very wisdomous. I quite enjoy his Instagram, and that's where I found this. So, children's achievements are not status symbols for parents. As a parent, your job is to support your kids in pursuing their own goals, not push them toward yours. The key question is not what accomplishment will reflect best on you, it's what activity will best build their character. And I think it's the perfect like capper to what you just said.
Yep.
You nailed it. You know, Adam Grant is a smart cookie, and therefore so are you.
And so are you.
Oh, thanks.
But yeah, I think that's a good way for us to close this one out, just with some solid parenting advice that we hope everyone listens to.
Yeah. And, you know, Emily and Richard will inevitably come up in more episodes, like, especially Emily, for sure. I definitely have something planned for season 7 where we talk about the Gilmore girls and the dynamics between the 3 of them. So we'll, you know, touch on further things that we didn't have to say in this hour and 21 minutes. So stay tuned for more. This was just like the tip of the iceberg of Richard and Emily.
Yeah, they will come up so many times. And so, like, we have episodes planned for, like, marriage, divorce. I'm sure they'll even come up in, like, boyfriend episodes with how they respond to that. Additional character studies that we do because they're always interacting with our leads. So you will hear more about them. But again, this is what we could give you to start out.
Yeah, this is like the high-level picture of Richard and Emily. And we'll get nittier, grittier in the future. As you said, like, more in conjunction with other characters and other particular moments.
Yep. What's coming up next for us, though?
Haha. Oh, I'm really excited for this one. We're going to talk about marriage next. We already had a discussion about proposals a few weeks ago, and we'll talk about weddings as events at a later date. I think when we touch on season 5 or 6 of Got Us Talk About Weddings. So we're just going to be talking about how the institution is presented in the show and sort of how the characters interact with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll try to keep that one to an hour as well, but there's always so much to say. In the meantime, as always, go back and check out some of our old videos while you're waiting for the next Friday night dinner. There's a lot of content that we already have under our belt that you can just go back and review, and just do all of the YouTube things to help us out. It's one click, like and subscribe. Takes you a second.
Drop us a comment.
Yep. Reach out to us on social media, email us. We have all that info in the description below. But we'll leave off that Friday night dinner here because we do want to get out of Emily and Richard's house. There's only so much time that you can spend there without going nuts.
Yeah.
So we will see you next Friday night for dinner. Take care until then.
Bye.
Bye.